we're going to leave this pretty open and conversational again. So if you have questions or feedbacks or comments, just raise your hand. I'll come run a mic to you. I asked this group to come together and talk about, now that we're not really going to super glue thumb drives, and we're not really going to lock down every port on a computer anymore, and we don't really have the power and the clout that systems administrators would have had 10 years ago to really lock down access. What does that mean to us as organizations, and how do we empower development and growth while putting in, safety and security into infrastructure? So this panel up here can address that in really interesting and different ways. I'm going to start with our new member up here. So Kurt is a new addition, and he came last spring, right, into January. Okay. And he is the new IT director. Is that the correct title for Bellingham? Okay. So he's the IT chief at Bellingham School District, and he has some really exciting and interesting challenges in front of him as we look at how we're going to educate our K-12 workforce, and just all of the challenges and opportunities that we have within the school district. So I think he's going to add a lot of texture to the super glue conversation. You met Jim and Shay and Sean already, so I'm just going to kick it over to you, very capable people. And if anyone has any feedback or questions, just raise your hand and I'll come with the mic. So.
Okay, I think I got nominated as the moderator here, so I'm going to try to tee you guys up with awesome, fun, and exciting things. Why don't we do a quick popcorn round of an active thing that you're working on right now, or if that's sensitive and private, an active interest that you can share.
Sure. So one of the things you guys touched on a little bit in the previous presentation is the overall migration to cloud services. So we recently started the process of moving from an on-prem Exchange implementation up to an Office 365 hosted implementation. So different than FaithLife's position, we stuck with the Exchange framework moving forward. Microsoft makes that fairly beneficial in terms of a pricing perspective for public ed customers. So part of that has been looking at that from a pragmatic perspective as we're moving forward, because there are various components to that. So the messaging migration was the first part of that, but as we're looking at the storage migration and the app migration, looking at wrapping our arms around the training necessary and the data protections necessary for that. Again, different from the corporate environment, we still have data privacy concerns in terms of protecting student information, FERPA regulations that we need to comply with, and to make sure that as we're implementing that for both students and staff, that we're properly similar to the corporate environment, making sure that they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot and take a block of student IEP data that's great to share with the IEP team and drop it into the default folder that Microsoft sets up to share with everybody, and create some issues. So trying to work through that and work through a way that we can move it out as aggressively as we can.
So popping up one level, just so the audience is aware, could you help everyone understand kind of what the big push is in the Bellingham School District? Maybe talk a little bit about the bond that you're able to wield, just so everyone knows kind of what our community is doing in terms of investment in information technology for K through 12.
Absolutely. So recently, the Bellingham community has been tremendously supportive of the school system and passed a technology levy. A big part of that was starting off with making sure that our kind of the rails are in good place. So the last number of months has been a focus on a heavy investment in infrastructure. So making sure that our wired infrastructure is in a positive place, as well as doing a substantial upgrade of our wireless infrastructure, implementing AC technology, and really making sure that we're ready to move into a higher density computing environment in the education space. So that's been a large part of the initial focus. The stepping forward from that has been the application focus with the Office 365 implementation. So that's been part part of what was funded by the bond, as well as starting a refresh process for the infrastructure in place for staff and student computing. So really getting the environment reset on more of a traditional life cycle replacement, so that we're minimally getting that piece up to snuff. Beyond that, we're also making a lot of investment in technology integration training. So looking at not only making sure we're providing the tools to the students and the staff, but we're also providing professional development opportunities for our students and our teaching population, to make sure that we're not just throwing out really cool technologies and crossing our fingers that they'll figure out a good way to implement it with kids. So we've got some great guy on staff who's working with that now. We're working with our Department of Teaching and Learning to make sure that we're really embedding technology very deeply into what we do wherever we can.
Excellent. Thank you.
The popcorn round.
Popcorn round.
I like that.
Shay, what's going on?
So
I burned the popcorn, sorry.
Well, one of the big pushes in government cloud services is something called FedRAMP, which is a baseline of security regulations that providers have to meet before they can be contracted to host government applications or services. So for us, that's great because it lets us know that you've done at least this much work. But then you run into this interesting issue of every organization has additional security controls that they require above the baseline. And so you're looking at taking things into the cloud, and you realize there's all these deltas where the FedRAMP certified provider, Amazon at this point, but soon others, doesn't do it as strictly as you would like it done. So you have to follow your own organizational policies. So now they've got to tweak a few things to fit what you need to do, because you can't launch it if you don't meet the policy. And then on the flip side, there are things where they're more strict than you are in your own organization, and it poses the question of, well, why don't you do that? And why would you want them to do that in the cloud if you wouldn't do that if you were hosting it? So how do you reconcile these deltas of what you want to do when someone else is doing it versus what you would do if you were doing it yourself? And it's actually a much harder question than you would think to answer, because it's a fundamental explanation or exploration of why you've decided to do what it is that you've decided to do. So people much higher than me are arguing that out, but I can appreciate the challenge there. If they do it this way and you don't, why not? Why do you expect them to do it this way? And will they be able to, so that they can take your money and you can get their service? So those are the discussions I see on the cloud in my house.
So cloud for us has been quite the journey. And by the way, you know this is a Sage panel because of the facial hair. So cloud for us
IT joke. Come on, yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Cloud for us has been quite the journey. When I first joined Mobile Iron 5 years ago, we were a mix of hosted rack space for email and Gmail, because all the engineers wanted Gmail. And then we decided, no, that's not what we want to do. We'll go to Microsoft Business Process Online Services, or BPOS, which was terrible. And so we lived through a lot of the growing pains of what eventually became Microsoft Office 365. Things got so bad that we actually took Exchange on-prem, and now we're bringing it back to the cloud. So we're actually in the process of transitioning back to Office 365. We looked at Google Apps and O365 head on head, and the challenge we have with a lot of our sales organization is they deal so much in Office that with PowerPoint and Excel and all that stuff folded in, it was almost a no-brainer because of the Office licenses being folded in. I think we're also certainly wrestling with a lot of the business process apps. So we're a huge Salesforce customer, and a lot of our customers are huge Salesforce customers. So we've been working with Salesforce on some kind of more prescriptive guidelines on, hey, if I'm going to go and roll out Salesforce to all these employees, how do I make sure that data is kept secure? How do I make sure that I don't have an entire phone book's worth of customer records going out the door with me when I move from Mobile Iron to a competitor or Mobile Iron to a different job? Sales guys are notorious for trying to take all of their contacts with them, and so we're definitely looking at that data security, as are our customers.
Yeah. So how about can you share with us kind of a juicy, like, the worst thing you saw a sales guy doing?
Professionally, the worst professional thing.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
I'll have to think about that.
All right.
Let me save that one for the end.
Sounds good. How about you guys in the category of heavy hitting nightmare stories, what have you come across that you're just like, oh no, is there something that stands out in your mind of?
That I do have. So
Okay,
has
let's hear that
anybody, the cautionary tale, right, for cloud is, and I wince a little bit as a startup guy because, you know, the challenge is this company going to be around tomorrow? So how many people here have heard of Nirvanix? Okay, they're a great case study for cloud. Nirvanix was a cloud backup company that went bankrupt. And all these people had all of their data being backed up for their data centers and desktops to this cloud provider. And there was an interesting panic, if you will, where people were desperately trying to get all their data on like literally 48 hours notice out of Nirvanix and into other tools, whether it was IBM Storage Cloud or Amazon S3 or what have you. So it was sort of an interesting cautionary tale to watch as an outsider, because I'd heard from colleagues of mine that were Nirvanix customers going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? These guys literally are shutting the doors next week because they can't pay their bills. How do I get my data out? So it's been sort of interesting. You know, I think customers are starting to look at cloud as a interesting, cost-effective way and I think, you know, Shay, you brought it up in the last panel. It's really good to say, if you don't have core competency to run these services, to take that off your books. At the same time, it's sort of a challenge to say, make sure that company's going to be around, you know, next month, and to be able to say, I also have a transition plan to take my services to another provider should something go awry.
I don't know if it's as tragic as Nirvanix, but the challenge is that we have particular requirements for government data, and one of them is that it has to be serviced by U.S. citizens in the U.S. And so when these cloud providers are saying, great, we've got 24-hour support, we've got a team in New York and a team in Dublin and a team in India. You have to say, okay, well, this call can only go to the team in New York. Oh, well, they're their East Coast business hours. Okay, well, now they need to be there 24 hours a day or else you can't have this contract. And to say that to EMC and have them say, well, that's not what we do, and then say, well, okay, then you can't have our contract. It's just such a different business reality, and it's kind of the opposite of a startup, but startups have constraints too, sure. Right? And so understanding what those are and then working around it, that's the point of the cloud, and it's not the best solution for everything, right? So if you've got needs that are hard to meet in the cloud, maybe the cloud's not for you.
Yeah, one thing that's just not maybe the juicy tidbit, but one thing that's an extension on the cloud discussion is, as a public school district, we're hit pretty regularly with Freedom of Information Act public information requests. So a big part of it, when you're looking at that need, as well as the business-oriented need, when you're looking at cloud services providers, is really trying to think through all of your business processes going into that. So as we're looking at it and we're auditing different providers, Office 365 being one of them, looking at the licensing levels and what we're required by state law to be able to provide, and trying to puzzle through how to respond to that, and especially as we're transitioning out and we're halfway between environments and making sure that we're supporting our legacy archiver infrastructures at the same time. So we got caught in the middle of that, which created an interesting archive retrieval problem, and I'll leave the rest of it for a future conversation at a bar.
Speaking of sales guys.
Speaking of sales guys.
So driving change can be very difficult. You identify something you want to make happen, and you set about to do it, and you hit hurdles and obstacles. Shay, I think you probably have the biggest machine to deal with. I was hoping you guys could kind of explore what it takes to make change happen in your organization. You see something better, an improvement. How does that play out?
Yeah, my machine. Yeah, it's not just that it's big; it's that it moves slow, and so that's a blessing in some ways and a curse in many ways. But the benefits are everything is very, very clearly defined. So at least you can figure out who you have to convince that this is a good thing, rather than, as you brought up, if security is everybody's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility, right? So it's very clear. Oh, this is a policy issue. Take it to the policy group. Okay, great. Oh, it's an ops issue. Take it to the ops group. Oh, it's a engineering issue. Take it to engineering.
And like, what's an example of one of these things that you would carry through?
Yeah. So one of I'll play off the Amazon and FedRAMP example of the policy decision to say, okay, If we can't reconcile our own security policy and what the provider is going to do, then what we need is a decision from the policy group saying it is our policy that we will accept a lower standard than our internal policy if it's a cloud provider. Because if we don't make that rule, then whoever does it first is just going to get crushed if the auditors come or if the Senate comes calling and says, well, why are you doing this with my taxpayers' data? But they've got to own that and make that decision. And so somebody up the chain has to be able to either drive that change all the way down through to say, not only is the policy going to change, but now every system that goes to the cloud is going to have to be up to the snuff, or every system that we're going to roll out from now on has to be up to that level, even if it's not in the cloud, because the policy now reflects this higher standard.
And what does that sign-off look like? I mean, is that like a consortium of lawyers and mucky-mucks, or like what are we looking at?
There's a lot of meetings, but eventually there's one person's signature on the bottom of the page, right? And that's again goes back to this responsibility issue. There's an executive who is responsible ultimately for the policy, and it's written in the meetings, and there's calls, and there's this, and there's that, but it goes to the ACIO for cybersecurity or the CIO, and that's where the buck stops. But the layers between the people discussing the issue and the person with the pen, 7, 8 maybe. So it's just, there's a lot of people you have to get on board to make that change, or a bad thing has to happen very publicly.
So
one or the other.
Yeah, Ryan, parents are probably involved in changes you're trying to push through. How has that played out for you? Have you seen any sort of demands placed by the soccer mom who's now showed up at the classroom?
No, never. I think dealing with parent expectation for us is a big part of it, and really it gets back to a larger question as well as not only the parent needs but the staff needs, is how quickly as an organization you can push forward large scale change in a way that the organization can absorb and not get crushed under the fatigue of the transition. And a big part of that for us, as we're looking forward, there's mention made earlier of a definite need for a shift to a higher density computing environment, or a new suite of cloud applications, and what does that do to changing the educational process. So in implementing any of those large technologies is trying to get time allocated with staff within all the things that they're doing already, to allocate the appropriate amount of time to get people's heads wrapped into that new environment and get them the training that they need to take advantage of it, so it doesn't become one additional thing on their plate, or that the security protocols that we're talking about putting into place to make sure that they're being good stewards of student data, that they're following the compliance needs, doesn't fall by the wayside because it's one more email that is a snowflake in a snowstorm that they didn't have a chance to read, and trying to make it meaningful and absorbable at the same time.
And Kurt, sorry for that moderator party foul there.
You can call me Ryan anytime you want. It's okay.
Ryan, Kurt, definitely Kurt. Sean, making change.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly, we live both sides of this, right? So we're trying to both drive change in our customers as well as drive change ourselves. And, when we've made this shift to various different cloud apps recently, I talked about it in my presentation. It's really important to be going in and talking to your users once you've kind of said, hey, here's the goal. Now let's figure out what my users are going to be able to absorb. That Gmail to Office 365 question was pretty fundamental inside the company, and God bless IT. I mean, they probably went through 50 people in a 700-person company to figure out which platform was going to be consumed. And we had a lot of people going back and saying, hey, we need to run O365 because I deal with customers that run Exchange, and there's Google Calendar idiosyncrasies and all this other stuff. Or, in my case, I went back and I said, look, I have 3 years worth of email on my laptop. Can that work in Gmail? No. Okay, and then it's a non-starter. Why do you have that much email? Because that's how my brain thinks, and maybe sometime we'll move to Jive or whatever, but I'm on an airplane and I need 3 years worth of email. So, that kind of came up again and again, and it sort of led to the platform decision. I think when we look at our customers, the most successful change agents have been cases where all the stakeholders are at the table, right? So you've got the business who's saying, I want to do X, Y, Z. I want everybody to have a tablet, or I want to have tablets for this particular use case. And you have the networking team who's going to be responsible for how am I going to segment the network? Am I going to allow these devices on Wi-Fi? How am I going to protect, do guest access or whatever? And I have the security guys who are going to be responsible for the endpoints themselves and the data in motion. And then you can actually start to get stuff done, because IT can put the business goal on the table, and security isn't just to go in there, no. They can start to compromise and go, okay, I see what you're trying to do and why. Let's have a conversation about how to get there in a way that meets regulatory goals, that meets my organizational compliance goals, and doesn't leave us exposed. Because I think most people in security want to do the right thing. We're not just sitting there going, no. Right? I mean, there are the occasional guys, I guess, who want to reduce the amount of work they have to do. But generally, they're saying, this is a challenge for me organizationally. And when you can have business there at the same time, or the other stakeholders at the same time, it really, really makes things a lot simpler.
One of the hard things about cloud changes brought on by the cloud is you're not only changing what you're doing, but you're changing how you're doing it at the same time. And so for us on the government side, we're basically on the plane, like on the plains of Montana, and there's a giant cloud in the distance, and we can see it, but we're not there yet. So the first thing to do is, okay, do the same thing that you're doing now, but then do it in the cloud. And then, once you've got that ironed out, which there will be kinks, then you can start to harness the power of the cloud to do things that you couldn't do before because of the cloud. So that two-stage change, again, it takes time, the machine is big, moves slow, but it's not trying to do it all at once, and I think there's some benefit in that could be approached at a smaller scale if you have the timeline.
I do think, though, going just to torture the analogy, if we kind of continue to look down the plane and say, if I were to travel 450 miles and get down to the other end of it, what does the world start to look like? I'm starting to see signals from our customers where I think you're going to start to see customers with zero footprint data centers, where literally, like, I can use Amazon as my DMZ, I can run Office 365 or Gmail or Google Apps for collaboration and productivity. I've got Salesforce for all my CRM stuff, Workday for HR, and if somebody needs a desktop, I'll fire up an instance in Amazon Workspaces and be done with it. And it's funny because I start to talk to customers and they see that vision too, and they're getting really excited about it in the sense that the operational overhead will go down, and in theory it means we can move a lot of resources toward projects that are more strategic to the enterprise than running servers. I think the question is going to be, what is the actual operational overhead as I move everything from a CapEx expense to an OpEx expense? What is that going to mean for my IT budget? I'm not sure that part's been thought through yet.
Ooh, what does that mean? The shift from CapEx to operational expense. Like, what if you're going to pitch that? Like, what? Bring us up to speed.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, if you look at like Adobe Photoshop, right? Used to be back in the day, you bought Adobe Photoshop for like, I don't know, $700, $800, and you had it forever. And you had to pay for upgrades, and you had to pay for support if you cared about support. But, for all intents and purposes, you own that software. And that was a capital expense. You put that out in your budget. Now, if you look at Adobe Creative Suite, which includes Photoshop, it's like, I don't know, a couple $100 a month or something. And you're paying yearly for that service. And so that shift becomes, I need X million dollars a year to pay for Microsoft Office, to pay for all these services. I'm not having to pay for the power and the lighting in the data center anymore, but I am having to pay for the software itself, rather than shelling out every year or every couple of years for new versions of Windows, new versions of Office, et cetera. It changes sort of the budget planning cycle, because you're paying for these things yearly, and your capital outlay, this big chunk of sunk cost, goes away. So it also comes down to accounting. There's liability and depreciation, all that stuff, and I'm not a CFA, so I'm not going to talk about it. But that's sort of the gist of it.
So that's excellent. And the value of the cloud is obvious. The change from capital expenditure to operational expenditure is huge. You can stretch your cash position out, and that makes you more powerful as a business. Bringing the security conversation back into it, as these things become more as a service, what's your guys' feeling on, is security as a service coming alongside that? So when you go buy into your hosted exchange? Are you feeling like I'm better or worse than I was when I was doing the capital expense game?
It can bring a scary amount of vendor lock-in. Like if you look at Office 365 and you go back and you say, I want to run a Barracuda spam filter. Absolutely not. Here's Forefront. We'll sell it to you as a service, but I really like my Barracuda spam filter. I want this gateway running on my mail. Absolutely not. Gateways are not supported by Office 365. So that part gets a little bit tricky when you start to look. Yes, security will become a service. It may not be from the vendors you want them to be, though. I don't know if you've got...
Yeah, it also locks you in a different way. One thing in terms of protecting PII, we've been looking at Office hosted encryption as an example to looking at transitioning health plan information, IEP information, just to further secure that data, which is great until you have a third-party email archiving solution. If you want to get the encrypted message, which you can do absolutely nothing with. So it does lock you into that. One thing that we really haven't expanded that scope into is we do go out to each year we have a segment of our work that we bring in independent auditor to kind of do a best practices review. Simple one this last year was Active Directory Services architecture, looking at best practices, domain controller placement, security posturing, things along that line. So as we move out into these third-party providers, again, as we're looking at, bringing in, for, small, medium, and up, is expanding that, looking at that third-party provider as well, looking at how well they're doing their particular slice of the business and what other impacts or things that you should be considering. Something down to as simple as you've got a secure environment, but you're caching locally in a way that is defeating that.
So for me, we haven't moved anything to the cloud yet, but I would say in general, you have to be pretty large and pretty sophisticated to start to wonder if the provider can do it as well as you can. And for the most part, they're going to be so much better, so much more responsive, so much more uptime, so much more everything that you care about than you could do unless you wanted to dedicate significant resources to doing that for yourself. Just as a rule of thumb.
Right. Well, and we see that kind of in the vendor side of things. So we run a cloud instance of Mobile Iron. You can basically buy it as a service. And a lot of our customers who went on-prem because it's security and it has to be on-prem are freaking out because we release updates quarterly. And so every quarter, because there are new operating systems, there's new features, there's new patches, like literally we're putting out a new version of our software and customers' IT teams are going, I can't deal with this, the sheer amount of updates you're putting out. Well, I mean, it sort of is what it is given how fast mobile's moving. And they're starting to look now and they're saying, okay, can I buy this as a service instead because I don't want to deal with the operational upkeep.
Up here, who's got some questions?
So, Wall Street Journal spent a lot of time talking about how IT projects are moving outside the IT department. Now with the cloud, do you see the cloud as potentially almost decimating the IT department? Because if you go to a model where it can be a subscription, now you've got departments like HR that go pick up their own software. You might not even know about it until
Shadow IT.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there are certainly some applications within the HR environment as an example where some of it is completely outsourced. We use a couple of different online providers. HRM Plus is the company to do some of those HR applicant functions that normally would have been an internal managed application. In terms of other parts of the equation, when you're looking at a hosted Exchange environment, you still are dealing with user provisioning, you're still dealing with Exchange system administration, especially if you're dealing with DIR-SYNC architecture where you still have a component of your directory services locally. So short answer, I think it depends on the service. I don't see it going away. I definitely see a change though.
I don't know that I'm necessarily best suited to answer this, but if you've ever tried to set up these services to then work together with an outcome that is something a normal person can make sense of, The IT department is not going anywhere. They'll be doing different things, and you might have an outsourced IT department, and your spend might be on a contractor who gives you a day a week to come in and set your things up. I can see that. But IT as a function in an organization, it's not going away.
User access management for even a medium-sized enterprise is tricky because remember, you can go and do single sign-on, all this jazz, but Salesforce is still going to want to have a user object, and somebody has to provision it somehow. And if you want that tying back to things like AD, then they get to Shay's point, it gets really tricky. We do, though, if you kind of look at the stats I was talking about earlier, when 48% of enterprises have built at least or deployed some commercial app to mobile, and half of enterprises don't have a mobile strategy, that says some tail is wagging one dog, some dog, right? I mean, and we do see a lot of business-driven projects starting, and I think the cloud and mobile together are acting as enablers for it. Because there's a funny story. You're asking sort of, what's the worst we've ever seen? There was a global 2000 manufacturing company, and the CIO decided, I want to start an iPad project. He literally went to the Apple store, because Apple doesn't give discounts anyway, and he bought hundreds of iPads at a time from the Apple store, trucked them in, and said, somebody figure out how to support these. Best Buy is another good one where that happens. So certainly it's sort of, sorry, it was VP of Sales, not CIO, sorry. And the CIO was the one who freaked out. He goes, what do you mean that you're just deploying iPads for everyone? So there's a lot of interesting stories where the business unit's driving it. The thing, though, is that if the business unit's going to drive that deployment, the question comes back to who owns security, who owns the disclosure if something goes wrong. So I have a cloud service with all my customer data, and something goes wrong, and now I've lost it. How, is the VP of Sales now going to take on the responsibility to inform customers, or is there still that procedure and process function that needs to be run by somebody inside the organization? My gut is that that's still going to be IT. I think APIs are great. A lot of folks, as a company that develops software and services, we always get use cases where customers are coming back to us saying, I want to do X, Y, Z, and things the product was never really meant to do, but the data's there and the actions are there. They're just not tied in the UI, and APIs are a really great way to do that. We are seeing, kind of REST, early days of REST and web services APIs, are kind of username and password driven. I think the broader trend is to do one of two things, which is either use some sort of tokenized mechanism to authenticate the service that's consuming the API, and you can use SAML or OAuth or whatever as your method of choice. The other one is to use PKI as a way to authenticate the API. So if you look at things like semantic managed PKI and you want to request a certificate via web services, you have to have the administrator certificate to be able to do that. And it's just a more secure way than trying to use username and password.
I still think it's a business decision, right? So is there more value in doing that than risk? Great. Is there more risk than value? Yeah, maybe not.
Same, yeah.
Cloud services and vendors. I'm in healthcare, and we get audited. We have to attest to everybody down the line, even to, and by the way, I'm controlling your subcontract.
Well, I think having a set of requirements that your contractors have to meet that's in the contract or in part of the service level agreement or whatever your enforcement mechanism is, forces you, A, not only to think that through and think about what's important to you and things that you need to make explicit. B, it's probably going to inform your own operations to say, why would I make my contractor do this if my own guy wouldn't? Okay, maybe I should make my whole team do it. But B, it gives you that level of, okay, well, it was in the contract, and so you're in breach, and you can't be there at the keyboard in every office, in every instance that you use or that your contractors use. But if you can do the due diligence up front, I think that's as much as anyone would ask of you. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know about contract enforcement, but it would certainly help.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the service. I think, and as you were mentioning, the cloud service provider that is there no more, in terms of any one of those contractual relationships with a third-party service provider, it's figuring out what the level of due diligence is that is acceptable to the organization. I'm thinking about two examples. One was with it was a PCI issue with a credit card handling provider who swore up and down that credit card numbers never will traverse your network boundary, even though there is a host server on your location, until we did a packet capture and showed him that indeed those numbers were actually coming through unencrypted. So the part of it, I think, is as you're looking at that, or as you're looking at single sign-on solutions, and you're working with a third party that you're passing your credentials through their system. I think as you're sharing that responsibility out, one is making sure that you are selecting the reputable vendor that's going to be there tomorrow. You're doing your due diligence up front, and then just creating an appropriate level of check-in over time. And for larger providers, they certainly will be able to do it better than you more often than not. But that doesn't remove the occasional shake the trees due diligence to make sure that they're living up to their end of the bargain.
Yeah, and the reputable guys are going to have, SLAs published up front. We generally take that a step further. We publish them up on our website, so like month over month. There are lots of audit controls that the good guys should be following, FedRAMP being one of them for federal. SOC 2, which is another auditing framework, is a good one, and FedRAMP and SOC 2 kind of mirror each other depending on how granular you want to get about interpreting the regulations. And then obviously you want to be looking at not just as the application provider have good auditing controls, but is that application provider's data center provider following good application controls, right? Because at the end of the day, most cloud services companies don't run their own data centers. I mean, they're hosting in Amazon or Equinix or whatever, Rackspace, and so you want to make sure there's good controls there as well. But anybody who's reputable should have a team that can go through and walk you through how they think about operations and how they think about security and what auditing controls they have in place.
What are your guys' thoughts on the risk of cloud computing as far as uptime? Because it adds another layer. You have to have internet connectivity for most of these apps to function. So you then have contracts with your ISP that guarantees uptime. What happens then is if the lights go out, nobody's working. That's a lot of money lost every day.
It's definitely something that plays into it. As an example, Office 365 hosting is a great example. There are ways to mitigate local operations. You can set up an OST so that offline caching can occur. You're incurring other issues when you're doing that. There certainly is a business risk to that. When you're looking at something like that to start considering path diversity. Looking at dedicated QoS to a particular provider to ensure that you're getting the performance levels that you need out of a particular application. But that feeds in a lot of ways into that cloud service becoming another part of your business strategy, and just working that into the planning process that you normally would do.
For me, I like the kind of classic definition of risk when you evaluate this, which is likelihood times impact, right? So how likely is it that this would happen? And if it did, what would the impact be? And you can kind of do that with the steps in your chain, right? If the cloud service goes down, okay, this. If our link goes down, okay, that. If all of the power is out, well, there's not really much we can do from a service level agreement perspective. Although that would be nice if there was a PSE link. Yeah, but you can kind of get a gauge, just at least a gauge at each step along the way, and decide, all right, what do we tackle first, and how much do we put into that? Because otherwise, it's just speculating. So,
and it depends on kind of what business you're in, but I do think this kind of broader shift from traditional laptop to kind of the Microsoft Surface, iPad, Galaxy tablet type form factor raises an interesting point around resiliency in the fact that a lot of those devices are cellularly enabled. And with kind of some of the work that Apple's been doing around kind of day plans and then their virtual SIM, it's like, hey, my internet connection went down. Great. Well, a bunch of you have tablets, so fire up a day plan and get back to work. Because the likelihood that you would lose both the internet in your office and the cellular connection, trust me, at that point it's a zombie attack, and you might as well be looking for shelter, because it's whether or not you're getting your job done is probably the least of your worries. But it definitely kind of an interesting, future trend, I think, that'll manifest itself over the next couple of years.
When people think of cloud applications, obviously we talk about email as the obvious one. But the next discussion is usually about sharing storage services, Dropbox, Box, on and on and on, Hubby, SugarSync, and on and on. What do you guys think about those things from a security point of view? Because the convenience is phenomenal. Everybody can take the data any way they want. It's always there. But what about from a security perspective?
If you don't provide something, then your users are going to do whatever they want. So, and that's going to be worse for you than a solution that's pretty good but leaves some things to be desired, right? So whatever that is, otherwise it's just going to go, they're going to email it to themselves on their personal account, and they're going to go wherever they're going to go and pull it back down and then email it back into the enterprise. And so something's better than nothing in that case. But I think one of the themes is listening to your users and understanding what they're trying to do. Not necessarily that they want to use Dropbox, but they want to be able to share files across devices. Okay, great, I can facilitate that. So that would be my take on sharing services.
What do you think is secure?
Well, maybe Sean's a better.
I mean, I think the usual suspects, Box, Dropbox, Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, are all focused on, while they're sort of prosumer tools, if you look at it from the outset, a lot of these guys are winning huge enterprise accounts. I mean, you don't, as Box, you don't go and win an account like Toyota without having some pretty good enterprise security and compensating controls behind it. So I would be less worried about those guys than, say, the next new guy out of the gate. I think the bigger challenge, the question that is in the back of my mind, kind of reading the S1 for Box, so the initial public offering for Box, and looking at how aggressive Google is getting around pricing, is just the broader longevity of a lot of these tools, and with pricing dropping through the floor, are the standalone guys going to be able to survive, or is it going to be a world of simplicity from EMC and Google Drive from Google because they can eat some of the operational overhead due to their economies of scale? But by the way, we like Box. Box is a great partner.
Yeah, I think the big part to it is making sure that as an organization that you are providing something so that your users aren't in a position where they're starting to choose their own adventure and what solution they're actually picking for themselves because you're not providing it as an organization. Most of the bigger players, as you stated, are going to have the security levels in place, and again, you can start having those conversations with your end users about managing security within that, because there is some inherent delegation of authority in terms of sharing content in a lot of those providers as well. The larger security issue, I think, is which is maybe a topic for a longer conversation, is once you have hitched to a particular solution, how you start managing messaging with your team about transitioning from whatever they are using into that solution, and start addressing that from a protection of information, because typically if somebody's coming in with that solution, it's a mixture of personal data and other content, and they're using it for convenience, and then you really have some information about intellectual property and data security that are coming into play.
This sort of comes back to this whole idea of understanding what is my risk. Like, not only what does my organization do and what do I want to protect, but also what's the risk profile of my organization, and what is my risk tolerance for all the different things that I want to protect, right? Because I mean, it's not easy in education, but it's more straightforward in the sense that there's guidelines to follow. In kind of corporate enterprise, manufacturing, it's squishy, but one might argue that if you're, Michelin and you're making tires, the new tire tread patterns and the patents behind all that is something that you want to be protecting, and that's probably going to have different information classification than, say, the regional sales phone tree list. And so you may decide this is highly sensitive. I want to keep it under lock and key. I'm not going to put it into various providers because I'm concerned about their security levels, or having really honest upfront conversations with those providers to say, hey, this is the type of data we're going to be working with, and I need to have assurances, contractual or otherwise, to make sure that if there's a breach, we have some sort of recourse.
Got a question about passwords. How pro are you guys on two-step authentication with cloud services? Is that the standard?
I think it sucks on mobile. It's terrible. I mean, the problem with, if you look at it from it's fine on laptops. I think it works fine, totally fine when you're on laptops. The challenge you have is that a lot of folks are using their smartphones as a way to access those services. So the worst is I'm sitting there on an airplane with my phone trying to access Salesforce. I'm, due to risk-based authentication, an unknown user, and so I'm having to wait for a text message that I can't get because I'm on a plane to authenticate to the thing I want to get access to. So, I think it comes down to, if you're going to put in two-factor, make it friendly. The good news is that there are a lot of emerging frameworks. So RSA, as an example, is in the process of building NGX, which is their kind of next-gen auth, and they're looking at not just SMS, but say, hey, if SMS fails, let's go to color PIN, or let's go to video, or let's go to voice authentication, or let's go to OTP. So that way, depending on the usage scenario, the user can still get into the service, and it's friendlier depending on what type of device they're authenticating from.
I don't know about anybody else, but if you saw the Dropbox news and went in to change your password, I also went in to turn on two-factor. I'm like, great, send me the other part, here's my cell number. And that text never came. And so now I'm like, wait a minute, now what do I do? Do I go back and turn it off? Do I turn it on again? Now I really don't trust you at all. So yeah, there are hurdles even if you're even if you're Dropbox.
Hosted within the boundary. I'm a little bit less trustworthy when it comes to shifting that type of password management outside of the boundary. So my tendency is to keep that more internally focused, but that's just paranoid me.
Yeah, we have an internal version too, but it's hosted internally and it's two-factor to authenticate to it every time you use it and every time you want to change one of the passwords. So it really is inconvenient to use it, but it's more inconvenient than remembering, or less inconvenient than 24 last versions of the password. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think most companies who are really looking at cloud and they're looking at multiple cloud providers are starting to go down the road of some sort of tokenized authentication mechanism. So you're not having to, one, remember 13 different passwords, and two, if you're going to do two-factor, you're doing two-factor at the beginning of the day and during a session boundary, rather than I'm going from Salesforce to Workday to Concur to Office 365 and constantly typing and getting text messaging. I'll have to go to an unlimited text messaging plan just for the number of texts I'm going to get. And so I think there's a lot of solutions out there, including ADFS and I know Google's talking about building an IDP. That I think actually is worth the investment, because it's going to simplify a lot of the work for end users and add a decent degree of security.
What considerations should be weighed when migrating maybe like a proprietary desktop application into a cloud structure? Basically, the crown jewels, but you need to access them via the web.
Well, you can always start
Everybody's looking at me.
You can always start with the worst case scenario, right? Like, what is the worst possible thing that could happen? And depending on the application and what you're doing with it, or what you'd like to try and do with it, you can start there. And that at least gives you a sense of, okay, if we can work forward from that, then maybe we can make a case for this. I think there are probably going to be less and less instances where a proprietary piece of desktop license-based software is something that you're moving as an organization, right? Unless you're Adobe. This isn't really something you're going to come across every day. Otherwise, if you're building a product, you're probably going to build it cloud first, mobile first anyway. So I don't know how many people are going to run into that. I suspect you have a particular example in mind. Not that you have to share. I'm just.
Well, it's just a slew of exe files that are running the company. With the desire to move maybe a virtualized machine.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what we see a lot from customers is so moving that proprietary EXE-driven thing into a web service, particularly if you don't own the code, it can be daunting. And I think what we see from customers is they'll start that project to move the data store, if they can, to web services. Not even for UI, just make the APIs web services, and then you can start to look at what UI do I want to skin on top of it, whether it's web services, a web UI, a mobile UI, what have you. We sometimes see VDI as a transitional way to do that. So you can go to any number of providers, get a virtual desktop either on-premise or in the cloud, I think is becoming really interesting for customers because of the elasticity. I'm not paying for compute time in the data center constantly to maintain these desktops. I can just basically fire it on demand in the cloud. And that provides me a way to get access to that legacy app without having to pay for the operational overhead. The challenge, I think, with VDI is it depends on what type of interface, it depends on what type of endpoint you're connecting from. So VDI is great if you're inside the enterprise on a wireless network with a laptop. VDI is terrible when you're on a cellular device with a tablet, both because of latency as well as because you're trying to take a mouse and keyboard-driven interface and put it to touch, and there's a lot of folks who've kind of tried to make that work, and I've never seen a very good example of it. So it ends up being kind of a stepping stone to say, look, we want these things out of our data center. We want to be able to get going quickly. Let's start to build that kind of phased journey that Shay is alluding to.
And just alluding to the earlier conversation, again, if that really is the crown jewels of the organization that you're shifting out, it's really being careful about your due diligence in looking at what the standards are for the organization that you're thinking about shifting it out to, and what those security standards are, and really having that risk assessment in a very open fashion with the executive level team in the organization. Because if you make that decision independently and move it out and bad things happen, it helps to share that responsibility of that decision.
And I think to that end, I mean, going back to the executives and saying, look, we've had this system for a decade. What do we, is it going to cost us more to migrate it than it would be to cut over, right? So another option, right, is to say, I'm going to move my legacy EXE-driven SAP app to Salesforce. I'm not even going to necessarily worry about the migrating every piece of data. I'll kind of maintain both in parallel and then cut over once I no longer need the legacy stuff and the 5 years worth of records. PKI. Sorry, certificates. I mean, I really do think that the more you can do to make authentication transparent to the user, while at the same time having a strong sense of who that user is, the better, right? So rather than say, I know username and password, and now I need to go and prompt for a text message, it's like, look, you either have the certificate and it's valid, or you don't. And if you want to overlay technology on top of that, that's fine. But certificates have been really hard on desktops and laptops. I think as those tools have matured and become easier for both mobile as well as desktops and laptops, it's definitely a thing to consider.
So then, just playing this out, the distribution of the certificate becomes the key thing here, right? So, and maybe you could sort of elaborate on how distributing a certificate works out and how that gives you the control that you need.
Yeah, I mean, I think, basically when you enroll a device, whether it's through a mobile management system or Active Directory has a ways to do this for domain joined PCs, you can basically set it to say, when the device enrolls, that device gets a certificate, and you can think of a certificate as a bit like a passport, something that represents my user identity, and I hand over to say I'm Sean. And I can get that exchange back for a passport stamp to say I'm allowed into the country. So to torture the analogy, you can say I can get that back for a token that I can present to an application server to say, I can authenticate. So that certificate distribution process also has the advantage of, somebody goes through and says they lost their laptop. I don't have to go and tell them to change 30 different passwords. I can go through and say, I'm revoking your certificate for that endpoint. So you basically end up having a representation of the user's identity on each individual endpoint that I can easily take back or revoke in the case that that endpoint is lost. I don't know if
That's great.
Do you see that coming down to consumer level, though? I mean, this is much easier in an enterprise, harder to think about, like a world of Apple Pay and Touch ID. How do you manage certificates when everybody wants one on their cell phone? And
Yeah, I think for consumer services, it's harder, right? And I think my view is sort of on the business forum side of things. And I do think, though, if you're building an application, you can easily decide what you want the authentication mechanism to be.
Yeah, I think the bigger challenge in our space as well, in terms of your original question of the death of the password, I think it's looking at PKI and a lot of those things coming down. It's definitely something that we can and should push our individual partners for. Thinking about what we deal with in our space, there's quite a large number of services where, as a consumer of that service, the password is the entry point. So it really for us is still in the business of managing that. Though that's something that as we continue to push our partners collectively as public agencies to adopt a more manageable strategy, that's something that is continually coming up as we talk contract renegotiation and renewals.
What if we were all 10 to 12-year-olds in this room and you were talking about why you've chosen your careers? What would that story be for us? And what resources were most helpful for you in your career development that you could appropriate into K-12 education?
So, well, hit me up with that one. So, looking at, for me, I mean, I specifically work within IT, but I specifically work within education. One of the things that's really rewarding for me is to be able to take that skill set that's been valuable for me and use it for inspiring kids to get involved in that industry and find something that they're really engaged in and can be successful with. The thing that was really powerful for me is really having some great parents that seeded that opportunity to me at a young age. So that's one of the things that, as thinking of the 12-year-old, is trying to seek out those opportunities where, for CyberWatch West, if you have an interest in an activity like that, avail yourself to those opportunities to learn more about that, be exposed to it, and that's something I think we as a local community are trying to do a good job of, is trying to promote those fields at a younger age so we can get that interest level when kids are younger, and then carry that forward as they move forward in their educational careers.
maybe I'll add to the first half of that question, which is why you chose this career. And so for me, I wanted something that was constantly changing. I'm easily bored, and that's not good for me or my employer. But I also wanted something that was constantly relevant. And I think the breadth of attendees today are all proof of that, right? You're all driven by technology in some way, but very few of you are pure technology companies. So if you can keep the technology side and add it to your other passion for, building boats or providing great healthcare or enabling a mobile experience that otherwise wouldn't exist, technology is the way that you can blend that and continue to move forward and always be adding and keeping up and learning. And so for me, that was, change and relevance.
So when I was in college, there was a friend of mine that said, there are two types of geeks, those that were born geek and those that were learned geek. And I was born geek. I was 5, and my dad had an old AT&T 8088, I think, that he'd gotten from the Department of Energy because he was doing work at home. And I loved it. I was fascinated. And so I'd constantly go, I'd play tic-tac-toe and other stupid stuff on his computer. And eventually he decided to buy me a Commodore 64 because he was deathly afraid I would somehow figure out the combination of characters to type format C, and then he would lose all of his data. And I think that, that early exposure of, hey, these are, there are things you can do with this other than playing video games, is definitely a way, that I think lured me into technology. And I think that there's some really cool stuff going on in the Valley. There's a lot of interesting ed tech companies that are trying to teach kids how to program. And it's funny because I sort of look at these things and I think to myself, that's Logo. I did that in first grade. I remember that. And, you kind of move the turtle around, like go 30 and it would move up. But, getting that early exposure is really important. And I think, presents the opportunity to get kids to be creative and learn.
Expanding on that a little bit, there was a comment by one of our student presenters about really being engaged in lifelong learning, right? And that's something that, working in the technology field, that's always changing. You're always having to research. You're always having to learn something new, and getting that engagement at a young age in terms of programming or working with computers at more than the game level gets your mind into that. I have to learn something new to make this next step, to learn something new to make the next step, and it not only helps with that, but also helps with a problem-solving mindset. Of being able to disassemble a problem, find what the relevant solution is going to be, and then move that forward. And that is extremely useful in technology, but also seeds into so many other areas of life for kids. So it's definitely fun stuff. TI-99 4A for me. So.
There's a question back there.
Not mine yet.
It's a little future looking. So I think for data communications, it could be very, very powerful, right? Because you can basically, with some of the kind of quantum data, photonic, the hell do they call it? Anyway, we're basically using beams of light and individual atoms to sense ones and zeros. You can basically create intrinsically encrypted links, and that could be very, very cool from a security perspective.
I think there's some encryption implications. Particularly, everything we have today will be immediately irrelevant. But on the flip side, if you have that horsepower, you can create something that can harness it for the new encryption schema that will be unbreakable until there's whatever comes after quantum, right? So you'll notice, but it won't be all bad. You can turn that force for good. Did you come up with your sales story yet, or are you going to let the iPad truckload one pass?
I was going to let the iPad truckload.
Okay.
I don't have a really good. The sales stories are generally the guy that basically steals all the data, walks out the door, and is never heard from again. I do have rowdier stories about sales guys, but we'll leave that for a bar discussion.
So we've got probably time for one more. Going to riff off our quantum computing. You guys afraid of the singularity? Are the robots going to take over and we will become obsolete? Is that our main security problem? Is that we're done for?
If C gets their way.
Right.
I don't see it as a professional problem. I think if that happens, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the singularity, I think Wikipedia is probably your best bet. It's very, very hard to explain in 10 seconds. It will be amazing, and I don't know if that's an amazing positive or amazing negative. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I bow to our robot overlords and look forward to supporting their new endeavors. I don't know.
Excellent.
Thank you all so much for
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
I think we have about 5 minutes while the rest of the breakout sessions come on down if you want to stretch your legs for a quick moment, and then we'll wrap up with Matthew Dunn. Thank you.